All right, we're at 2 past the hour. Welcome everyone to today's workshop on Sentry's performance monitoring and web vitals. My name is Schaefer. I'm on the marketing team. I'll be moderating today's workshop. Take a quick look at today's agenda before I pass it over to our host, Jeremy. We'll first just show you how to get started with performance. We'll dive into web vitals and how Sentry is incorporating Google's web vitals. We'll view some trends, analyze issues with Discover, and set up a metric alert or two. Then we'll take a look at what's coming next, and we'll wrap up as usual with Q&A. And stick around because we have a promo code that gets you some access to the business plan, so stay tuned for that. Just some small housekeeping items. I see it in the question and answer already. We will be recording this and posting it to our YouTube channel. So if you aren't subscribed to that, head on over and do so afterwards. We're going to timestamp it, so make it really easy for you to jump to any particular section that you were most interested in. If you do have questions like you already, I see, have, feel free to ask them in the Q&A. If you see something that's already been asked, go ahead and upvote it, and that will help us prioritize what we answer at the end. And then lastly, there's a one-question survey after the webinar. It will open up automatically after the webinar ends in your browser. We'd really appreciate it if you could answer that so we can make future workshops like this better. So now I'm going to introduce today's host, Jeremy Bourque. Jeremy is a product manager here at Sentry. And on to the fun stuff. I will pass it right on over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks, Schaefer. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. Really great to see everyone here. As Schaefer said, I'm on the product team at Sentry, and I'm the product manager for the performance tool. We're talking today about the performance monitoring part of Sentry. And these are sort of the 5 pillars of Sentry as we view them. Performance monitoring is the newest one. The most recent edition launched just a few months ago. And we added it because, you know, from the beginning, Sentry is really about helping you get an understanding of when there's a problem in your application, see when there's an issue, and get to the solution as quickly as possible. So that's why we provide, you know, all the information, the rich context, and so forth that helps you troubleshoot and helps you get right to the really even to the place in the code where you need to make a fix. But errors aren't the only issues that can arise. There can be performance issues as well. And if something is slow or your customer is having a bad experience because of a performance issue, that's important too. So that's why we chose performance as sort of the next area to focus on, to bring kind of that same approach to say when there's a performance issue, we'll help you see that as quickly as possible, help you understand what's happening, and get you right to the place to fix it as quickly as possible. So with that, I will share my screen and we'll dive into the demo. All right, Schaefer, can you give me a thumbs up just to make sure everybody's seeing that? Awesome, thank you. All right. So before we dive in or start off the demo, this is our online hardware store. As you can see, it's our designers worked overtime on this. It's really slick. Okay, it's not. It's a demo site, but this is sort of our representation of you know what you might go to an online retail site. If we go ahead and load this page, we'll see what kind of response we get. That was a little bit slow. That wasn't great. So you can see here all the network traffic, and I'll just mention, we'll come back to how to set this up towards the end. But this is right at the end there, you can see this is the transaction getting shipped back up to Sentry. So that's the package of information with all of the performance data about this page load. Let's switch over now to Sentry and see if we can see what's going on and maybe what's making that slow. So if I switch over, this is Sentry, which some of you will know and love. And this is the new performance homepage. So this is, you can see on the left nav how I get here. This is where I come for all my performance issues. So we saw that there was a slow page load. Let's see if we can get to the bottom of what's going on. Right here, I have my list of transactions. And that page load was the tool store page. So I can just dive into the tool store transaction. Right away here, I can get a summary and breakdown of what's going on with that transaction. So I can see kind of my duration breakdown. I can see individual examples and some of the slower transactions. I can also search. So let's zero in and say, let's say I want to know what's going on. I was in a Chrome browser, so I want to know what's going on with Chrome. So let's just say that browser name is Chrome, and we'll zero in on that. Now I can slice and get that specific experience and examples of different transactions that I can take a look at. So let's dive into one of those. Now we're here on the event details page, and I have an example transaction that I can see what's causing the issue. Up here in the mini map, I can kind of see the waterfall of all the activity that happened, all the different spans. I get a breakdown of where time was spent in different operations. I have my web vitals. We'll come back to those in a second, but I can see right away that my largest contentful paint is marked in red. So clearly there's an issue there I might want to look into. I also have my event tags and my breadcrumbs and all those other pieces. But just right away at the top of the page, looking at the mini map, we can see this long span that is taking up the bulk of the time for this transaction. So let's see if we can kind of zero in and see what's going on there. So I'm going to highlight just that section to see the start of that span. And here's that offending span right here. And it's this long transaction. Let's see what's going on. So it's actually an HTTP request happening in the back end, where I'm calling back out to one of my APIs to get some information loaded in the page. So this is the front end transaction, and the issue really in this case is in the back end. So what I need to do is kind of dive in, but because Sentry uses head-based tracing, when we've decided to capture the front end transaction for you, assuming you're sampling, if you're sampling at 100%, you'll get everything. But typically you'll be sampling your transaction data. But if we make the decision to capture the transaction, then we will capture the transaction all the way through the platform for all of your instrumented applications. So in this case, I've instrumented my Flask backend, and I can connect directly into the span and see what's going on in the backend. So now I've drilled through to the backend application, and I can have a look what's going on here. And I can see again that there's a couple of long spans. There's some nesting going on, but I can very quickly get to, okay, it's this run query span that's taking forever, and it's running this select query from the tools table. So I can see exactly how long the query took. I can see how long that the query only took a fraction of the time. I know what's going on here because it's a demo app. We put a sleep in the call to make it artificially slow so that I could show all this to you. But right away now I know like which application it's the backend piece, where to go in that application. It's this run query command that's doing something suspicious before it runs this database query, and I can dive right in and fix that. So just as quickly as that, I've gone from capturing the transaction in my application through to understanding where the slowness is coming from and where I can focus in order to improve that performance. Let's go back to the homepage for a minute, and let's go back to our demo application. So let's suppose now that I want to buy some of these really nice Allen wrenches. I'll get a couple of those, yeah. And then we'll go ahead and check out. Again, a little bit of waiting, maybe not the most responsive, but let's give it a chance and see what happens. Oh, shoot, we had an error. Okay, so obviously my site needs some work, but we had a crash. So I can submit a bug report, but let's go ahead and close that. Let's dive back into Sentry and see what happened with that transaction. So again, I have the transaction being sent up to Sentry. That was the checkout page. So let's have a look at the checkout transaction here. Again, we're in the transaction summary view. Just to touch on a few other pieces here, I can see the AppDex score, which is miserable because we've made this artificially slow. We can see the user misery score, which is a slightly different view of performance, talking about the impact on users and how many are having a good versus a bad experience. I can see the throughput and the failure rate. I can see if there's any related issues. So if there's errors that are associated to this, I can see right away on the summary view what the connections are there, and I could dive into those from here. But let's go a level deeper first. So if I dive into one of these examples, right away at the top of the page, I can see, hey, there's an error associated with this transaction event. So not only do we capture the transaction, but in the same tool, we also captured the error. I can see the span here is highlighted in red. So I can click right in and it tells me right away, hey, an error occurred in this span. Let's see what's going on. So now I can go over into the event detail for the error. And I can see all of the information that you're used to seeing for errors. I can see the tag cloud, the breadcrumbs, the code trace sample, all that stuff. And again, just as quickly as that, I've gone from the transaction in my front end through to the error that was captured, and I can start to troubleshoot this issue. And of course, there can often be a connection, right? Maybe that page was slow because it resulted in an error. Maybe the error, happened because of a timeout, things like that. So, my next step here would be to solve this and then see if that improves my performance, and I can go back into the performance homepage to see if that's the case. Now, if any of you have used the performance product before, you may have noticed that this looks a little bit different than it has in the past. The thing we've added most recently, and we're iterating on this is an early access feature, but we have these Web Vitals cards that have been added to the front page. And they kind of give you an at-a-glance view of the percentage of your transactions that are either passing or failing the acceptable threshold for the Web Vital. If I dive into one of these, like let's just choose First Contentful Paint, it shows me kind of a little rundown of what the Vital is about. I get the same search bar, so I can kind of slice and dice if I want to zoom in on certain things. And I see a list of my transactions and whether that is considered a pass or a fail. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. So Web Vitals is a concept that Google has introduced in an attempt to capture a more accurate view of what the user's experience is. Previously, you might rely on, say, transaction duration to get a sense of your performance, but modern single-page apps are typically the transaction is not completed before the user's already seen the page as visually complete and started to interact with it. Often there's additional resources loading in the background. There's things that are kind of below the fold that haven't loaded in yet. But we've gotten to a point of sophistication where the page is often visually complete and usable long before that. So Google has put forward this set of metrics. I think there are 6 in the set right now. 3 of them are considered core. And the First Paint and First Contentful Paint talk about when the first elements go on the screen. So sometimes they're the same if the first element is, has a visual component, or if it's sort of like a hidden element or an invisible element, then they might be slightly different. The one that's probably more meaningful in terms of paints is the largest contentful paint. So that is a measure of when the page essentially is visually complete. So that's when the page looks loaded to the user. The next one, let's just go back here so we can zoom in on these. So that's the largest contentful paint. The next one is the first input delay. This measures the time between when the user clicks on an element or tries to interact with the page and the page actually responds. Typically, if your page is interactive around the same time that your LCP has happened, the user won't attempt to interact with the page until it looks loaded. And if the page is immediately responsive, then your first input delay will be very quick, as we see here. And the final one, which we don't have in our demo right now, but it's content layout shift, which describes, it's an index that measures how much things move around on the page as it loads. And that's also can be kind of detrimental to the user experience. If you're reading a paragraph of text and then it suddenly moves and you lose your place, or you try to click on a button and just as you click, it shifts over. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but I certainly have, and it can be kind of annoying. So with that set of metrics, Google has instrumented their browsers, so the Chrome and Chromium browsers, to collect that information. And the other interesting development is they've also announced that the core Web Vitals are going to be factored into the PageRank algorithm. So it's something that I think a lot of folks are going to, have a lot more attention on in the future. So I think we'll be hearing more about them. But this is one of the reasons why we wanted to make sure that we had a view of them and we're kind of making that data readily available to you. There's a couple of ways to see those. We've seen I can dive in and get kind of the overview page across all my transactions. I could also, if we go back into the Tool Store application, come into the Web Vitals screen here. So this gives me, for this particular transaction, a detailed view into my different Web Vitals, whether they're pass-fail. The pass-fail threshold is defined in the Web Vitals sort of spec, and the way it works is there's a baseline here called out on each graph. That baseline is just the P75. So it's the time that 75% of transactions are faster than, and 25% are slower than. That P75 baseline is what's used to determine pass or fail. And then there are three ranges, but there's a poor range, which for first paint and first contentful paint starts at 3 seconds. So that's the failure threshold of saying basically performance is acceptable up to 3 seconds. Once these exceed 3 seconds, that's not considered a pass. And then for largest contentful paint, it's 4 seconds. So again, this shows you sort of an at a glance view, where your P75 is, whether you're kind of in the red zone or not, whether it's a pass fail. And I can also zoom in and get a more focused view. So if I want to have a look at kind of what's going on there, if I want to check out, this secondary mode on this page, there's kind of a couple of different, so there's a major mode and a minor mode here, and I can kind of look in and see what's going on there. And get a sense of what's happening with my web vitals. I just want to draw your attention to, there's also an open and discover button. We're going to come to discover a little bit later in the demo, but we can kind of drill through from here, and we'll come back to that in a bit. The next piece that I wanted to draw your attention to is on the homepage itself. So there's a little bit of customizability here. We've got a couple of at-a-glance graphs that sort of show an overview across all the transactions. Right now I'm focused on this particular front-end React project. If I want to see across all my projects, I can switch the filter bar and get a wider view. I can choose what I want to see here, and there's a few different options. So I can see my aptX, or I can see my failure rate based on the transaction status that's returned, or I can see different duration breakdowns. So if I want to see my median duration across all the different transactions, or my P95, etc., I can get all those overviews. I can search here as well. So if I want to, see a cut across all my transactions, but I want to see it, just for the Chrome browser, then I can do that sort of thing. And I can also do crosscuts with custom tags. So if I want to see, if I'm interested in focusing in, say, on enterprise customers, then I can do that and just get a view in and see sort of what do my web vitals look like, what do my at-a-glance views look like for that segment. And then lastly, down here, we have the list of transactions that we've been working with. This is sorted by default on transactions per minute. So how many transactions Sentry has seen for that, or how many transaction events Sentry has seen for that transaction, per minute type of thing, the rate at which they're coming in. And you get kind of a roll up of your P50, P95, the different views that you can see here, as well as unique users, and again, user misery. The other piece I want to draw your attention to is those key transactions. So these are basically just bookmarks, but I've pinned the interesting transactions to the top. So regardless of the sort I choose, and if I want to look at different sorts, I can sort by different things, but the key transactions will come to the top for me, so I can kind of focus on the most important ones if there are particular ones I care about. The other piece I want to show you, forgive me as I move Zoom windows out of the way, is the by trend view here. So this is another new addition where we've come to kind of show, what are the big changes that have happened in the last little while. So I can look, if I want, at the last 24 hours, the last 7 days, or the last 14 days, and see any sort of significant changes that have happened either for good or for bad in my transactions. So I can see, for example, like my checkout has improved only by 4%, but based on our analysis of the data, we consider that to be a significant, like it's a real improvement. It's not just caused by noise or variability in the sample. There is actually an upward trend, even though it's small. And similarly, I can see my most regressed transactions where I have things that have gotten slower. So again, in this instance, it's only by a small bit, but there's a definite trend of increased processing time that I could look into if I'm interested. So let's just drill into that tool store one again. If I come in from the trends view, I get a slightly different graph here. So when we came in before, we had the duration breakdown, but now we have the trends view, which allows us to kind of dig deeper into this data and see the kind of the smoothed view, which helps reveal the trend uh, contrasted with the raw data as well. So I can see the actual data, and I can hide or show either one of those if I want to kind of experiment. In here, there's also like duration percentiles. So I can see my distribution of duration percentiles. I can see my latency distribution. So kind of what my page load time looks like for different counts. And I can also get an overview here of web vitals as well. So I can see, you know, if I don't care about FP, but I care about FCP, maybe I don't care about FID. If I want to get rid of LCP because it kind of dwarfs the others, then I can sort of get a sense of those and so on. Let's suppose that so we saw that this transaction got a little bit worse. It was kind of 8% slower. Maybe that's not super concerning to me, but I might want to make sure that I don't miss out on something if it starts to get even slower again. So maybe I want to create an alert to remind me, hey, like if this gets really bad, let me know so I can come back in and take another look. So from here, I can go and create a metric alert. And this basically lets me define alerting thresholds and say, hey, I want you to notify me. So I can say, okay, it's a metric alert. I want to do it in my production environment. My data sources event type transaction is pre-filled for me because I came in from there. And it has all the pre-filled criteria for the particular transaction that I care about, and some of the transaction durations and so forth. So let me say I don't care about that. I just care about the transaction. But maybe I want to make sure that I'm only looking at transactions that have the LCP measurement because I'm going to set up my filter on LCP. And maybe I want the customer type again. So I really want to be notified when my enterprise customers are having more of an issue. The function I'm interested in is P75. And it's not of transaction duration, it's of LCP. And that can be a little bit noisy. So let's smooth this out over more of like a 10-minute window. And then we can see kind of the graph of, is this gonna give me what I want? And now I can define my threshold. So I can say, okay, if it gets above 10 seconds, so 10,000 milliseconds, that's critical. I want you to tell me about that. If it gets above a warning status, let's say if it gets above 8 seconds, then that's a warning threshold. And if it goes back down below 4 seconds, then that's resolved. So now I can see kind of where my alerting thresholds are going to be, and when I'll get notified or when the alert will kind of resolve itself and go away. Then I can choose the actions I want. So I can say, okay, I want you to email me, or I want you to email one of my teams, so everybody on the team in Sentry. Maybe I want to do that if it's a warning. So I want to say, hey, if there's a warning, you know, email the team. We'll email that team. Perfect. Now, if it's a critical status, we might want to send that to Slack. So maybe we'll if I have the Slack integration set up, then I can add the notification to Slack. I can at username or at channel. Maybe if it's critical, I also need to send it to PagerDuty. So maybe I have a PagerDuty integration set up, and I want to select which team or which escalation policy that's going to go to, and it'll automatically sort of escalate and make sure that it gets attention and action on that. And then I can give my rule a name and go ahead and save it, which I won't do because I don't want to bug Neil's deals for the purpose of the demo, but that's the kind of the setup process around the metric alerts. You can set them up on different functions. So if I want P95 instead of P75, if I want transaction duration for a backend transaction instead of LCP for a front-end transaction, all of that is configurable. Next piece I wanted to show you that ties into this as well as Discover. So we've seen kind of the performance views and what the product kind of makes available to you in all the default views, and there's a lot of different ways to kind of look at the data. But you may want to kind of explore the data in a more free-form way. If you want to, you know, look at things, group them in your own way, slice and dice the data along different tags and things like that. Discover is kind of our custom query builder and data exploration tool. So let's start with the pre-built transactions. So these are ones that kind of come as examples with the product, and you should see them in your account as long as the show pre-built tab is on. And we'll go into transaction by volume. So here I can see I have my transactions. I'm showing the count. So I'm getting the volume of transactions for the types I have. I've got my tag summary and the results of rolled up by the different transaction names. So I can see all of that. Let's give ourselves a little more working room by hiding the tags, and then let's see what we want to zero in on. So let's suppose, similar to what we were doing in the, let's say we want to look at things that have the LCP measurement. And I get suggested, there's documentation for all these as well, but I get sort of suggested tags so I can kind of explore and see like what are the different things. Maybe I want to focus in on Chrome browsers, and maybe I want to get that customer type, and I'll look at enterprise again. So now I've kind of zeroed in on this section of events. I can see how many events, transaction events that is. I can see that it's focused in now on my front-end React project, and I'm only seeing the tool store transaction because that's the only one that has LCP measurements. And so I can kind of explore and slice that way. But it's not the count that I'm interested in seeing. Let's suppose I wanted to set up something so that I could watch, well, for example, what my team does at Sentry, we have a couple of these set up to track SLOs for some of the pages we own. So that performance homepage, we have an SLO of having the P95 of 4 seconds or better. So we use the Discover tool to kind of set up a custom query that tracks that. So the first thing I want to do is edit the columns. So I don't care about the transaction duration. I'm not interested in these. I want the transaction and the project to be shown. I'm interested in the count, but it's not the thing I want to plot. What I want to plot is the P75 of my LCP. That's the thing that I really care about. So let's apply that and just focus in on that particular measurement. And then on the y-axis, I can choose that and say, okay, now I've got a plot and I can see exactly how my P75 of LCP, or in my team's case, we do P95 because we're a little more focused on some of the outlier or some of the larger, slower transactions at this point. So we'll do the P95, and now I can kind of trace my P95 transactions and see kind of how that's trending. If I want, now that I've set that up, I can save the query. So I can call that my tool store SLO, save that. And so I can come to Discover and come back to it. Again, the zoom window's in the wrong place. But I can come back to the different ones and find that query again. Wow, we've created a lot. Maybe I should search for it. There we go. So now I can come back to and I can also create an alert. So once I have, I have to select my project. So once I've set that up, I can select my project and create an alert, and all of the work that I did in Discover is imported right in here. So I'm already set up for my measurement that I want, my browser name, my customer type, the function metric, all of that is here for me in Discover. And the last thing I want to show you while we're in the product is I mentioned I would come back to that open in Discover. So let's go back to where we were in the tool store. Let's go back to the Web Vitals screen that we showed and see where we're looking at some of the different information here. Let's say I want to dig into the first paint and I want to look at this second mode that I've seen. So this is an interesting distribution here. There's something going on that I'm interested in. If I want to dig into that, I can click open and Discover. It takes me right through. I've got all of the same criteria, including kind of the section of the graph that I was looking at. So I was looking at measurements from 432 milliseconds up to 768 milliseconds. I can show my tags and I can start to see the tag cloud and what these things might have in common, and understand sort of why that mode might be there and start to play with the data to see what happens. I can save that to come back to it later. I can create an alert and go into the alert rule, all in just a few clicks. So That's it for the demo. The last thing I wanted to do was just show you where you can go to find setup information. So if you're not using performance today, if you already have the latest version of the SDK for JavaScript, for PHP, or for Python, and there's a number of different frameworks supported that you can look in the documentation. The documentation is all here. The setup is really straightforward. You can install the package with yarn or npm in the case of JavaScript, brings in the Sentry browser and Sentry chasing packages, and it's a shared setup in the init piece where you just set up your DSN, your release, and the integrations that you want to use, and set your sample rate for transactions, and that's all it takes to instrument your front end. And the other languages are documented here as well, but it's similarly straightforward for PHP or Python to kind of get set up and using this and get transactions flowing into the product. All right. Sure, there's probably a bunch of questions, so we'll shortly get to Q&A. But before we do that, I just wanted to mention, so I talked about PHP, Python, and JavaScript being the main platforms that are supported. We also have some support for serverless today that's available. We just added support for some of the common databases for Node.js. So now we have additional automatic instrumentation on different database calls and queries for Node.js in MySQL, Postgres, and Mongo. And we're going to be adding support very soon for the Vue framework, for Ruby, for .NET, for Java Spring Boot, as well as Go. So a whole bunch of additional support coming up in those SDKs. So stay tuned for that. And if there's a platform that you're using that isn't available yet, but it's on this list, it'll be coming soon. And eventually, performance support will be added to all of the SDKs. So let us know what you're using. If there's something that's missing that you want, I'd be happy to hear about that. And we'll see what we can do. And with that, we'll move over into Q&A. Schaefer, are you moderating the Q&A?
Yes, awesome job. Thank you so much. Thank you all for hanging in there. I see a lot of great questions. We're going to get to those real quick. Just a reminder, again, this is recorded. We will be sending out an email with a link to the recording. You can jump to any particular section of the recording that you may have found really interesting. They're going to make it really easy for you, so not to worry. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to dive right into these. The first one, we are a Cold Fusion shop. Is the list of supported SDKs all-inclusive?
Yeah, so I'm not a Cold Fusion. I don't have too much experience with Cold Fusion, Neil here. But it sounds like we're creating web apps here, so there's some element of JavaScript and HTML to it. So you would probably use the JavaScript SDK to instrument and surface some of those errors and such. But happy to help you through that.
Yeah, I can jump in and maybe add to that. So yeah, you can definitely use the Sentry browser JavaScript SDK for any front-end application that runs in the browser, and that will give you a certain level of instrumentation and automatically capture some of the spans. The difference with the frameworks is you get more detailed information out of the box, but you can extend the spans manually as well. So if you want to add additional instrumentation on top of what is available out of the box, Cold Fusion might be a good example of where you want to do that. Then you can customize and capture custom spans and decide where you want to add additional instrumentation based on your framework.
Thank you. Next one, spans. Are Sentry's client performance tools OpenTelemetry friendly?
I would say yes, they are OpenTelemetry friendly. So the OpenTelemetry spec is still evolving. Our product is heavily inspired by it. So I think that, at some point the spec will sort of solidify and we will probably support OpenTelemetry. I can't say 100% for sure one way or the other, but our design has been very much guided by that. So I would say it is very much OpenTelemetry friendly, to be sure.
Next, is the database integration compatible with all backend frameworks? The use case Doctrine with Symfony and API platform, for example.
So I'm not sure what you would get out of the box. Like, we have Symfony support, and if your database is supported, you'll get detailed query information. if your database is not supported, there will still be a span that contains the database operation, in the sense of like somewhere in that span tree, the database operation happens. You may not get out of the box with a non-supported database, you may not automatically get, say, the query or the query parameters or things like that. That, again, may be a place where if you're using one of the non-supported DBs, you could go in and add custom instrumentation to capture that. So you could add a span or additional span details with your query parameters and so forth if you wanted that degree of information. But you will get, you'll get a certain level of detail out of the box. It's just a little bit more with supported DBs.
Great. Are transactions captured automatically on both the front and back end, or do we need configuration to set them up?
Yeah,
Neil,
so
do you want to take that one?
yeah, I can take this one. On the front end, the page load is automatically going to be instrumented. So let's say you have a page that loads, and then some AJAX stuff that happens as part of kind of that whole page load, because you're probably trying to optimize things. So we're going to track all of that until the page stables, and that will constitute the page load transaction. And then anything else that would happen on the front end that you want to track after that, you would just start up a transaction for accordingly. And then on the back end, any API request coming in, it's more or less being tracked as a transaction, with then each activity happening as part of that API request and that framework being a span.
Yeah, and as I mentioned as well, if it is automatically tied together in the sense that if you capture a front-end transaction that makes a call to the back end, and both sides are instrumented with the Sentry SDK, then it will automatically capture that transaction as well.
Awesome. Next one. Is there any privacy concerns specific for the performance part of Sentry? I'm in med tech, so privacy is very important.
Yeah, so the transaction event's going to be a lot lighter than the default error event, because the error event's going to have all that context, the stack trace, and some more kind of deeper information in that sense. So all in all, you can kind of think of Sentry as an event ingestion engine. Now, that being said, we have data scrubbing on the SDK side, so it doesn't even get sent over the wire, which can apply for events being transactions or errors. And then we have data scrubbing on the server side as well, so to make sure, and if that data gets passed across the wire and it reaches our ingestion layer, we'll go ahead and scrub it before we persist it.
Moving right along, is the view span to look at the backend transaction available at the team or business plan level?
Yep, I will. It will work in both plans, but the gotcha here is that you're not going to have the global view stuff. So you'll be able to get to the specific span from one project to another. You're just not going to be able to kind of see it all within one dashboard, because the cross project is not there on the teams, but is on business.
And don't forget, we're handing out a promo code at the end of this. So if you guys want to try out the business plan for a month, stay tuned. Moving along, is it possible to distinguish between post request as different resource, which are requested on the same URL?
Mm-hmm. So you might have, Jeremy, feel free to chime in here, but you might have seen in the demo, there was a post request, and it showed, the URL and such. And once you kind of drill down into that transaction, you're going to see all the different attributes associated with that. So you'll see, for example, even payload and some of the other information that would help you distinguish that this is a different post request and such. And then once again, all of these events are going into Sentry, so you can query based on that attribute set.
Yeah, that's right. You should be able to query to kind of separate those out. It may not be by default on the transaction homepage because it's grouped kind of by the URL path. Although if you wanted to customize, you could also capture custom query name or custom transaction names and separate them out that way, if you wanted to go to that extent. You also might want to rely on the framework you're using. So I'm a React guy. That's the one I'm most familiar with. And I didn't show this in the demo, but one of the things that's automatically captured out of React is the operation. So you can, for example, go into I could go into that tool store transaction, and I could look at page load operations versus navigation operations and split those out that way. So that's another way that you can kind of slice across transactions on the same URL.
Cool. How does Sentry affect performance of the page?
Yeah. So I think the question also noted that stuff is being sent to the Sentry server, right? That's part of the magic here. But everything that we've done at Sentry, we've tried to be minimally invasive, from how we affect the app to the type of instrumentation that we do. So you might have seen as part of this performance demo, like the waterfall graph isn't, miles long. We're intelligently, it's not graph, the waterfall view. We're intelligently surfacing what we think is relevant in those frameworks and for the developer and showing that. Now, that being said, what's actually happening, right? We're not doing any polling or anything like that in the background. We're surfacing the page load transaction, or, on the API level, on the backend level, if it came in, we're tracking the appropriate parts of that transaction. And then gathering the data as we need in a minimally invasive manner. We try to mostly do that in big O of 1, and then asynchronously flushing it out, non-blocking. So there shouldn't be any impact. It should be completely negligible. That's what we're sticking to here and trying to do, not affect anything outside of just the Sentry bundle or Sentry code that you have to import into your bundle.
Great. This came up a couple times. We're already using Sentry for error handling. Does that mean I just need to go through the setup process in my Sentry.io?
Yeah, so what you'll need to do is just enable this within your SDK. So just enable the tracing integration, which then flushes out transactions to us, and you'll be seeing that data come in. And assuming you have access to the performance features and cross-project, you'll be seeing all of this to, all throughout.
Yeah, that's right. You don't, and you don't even need to do any special configuration in Sentry.io, as long as you're on a plan that supports performance. So if you're on one of our older plans that doesn't include performance, you may need to upgrade to see that. But as long as you're on one of the performance enabled plans, there's no configuration on the Sentry.io side. It'll just show up. You just need sort of like a 1 or 2 line code change in the init script to kind of set up the sample rate and turn on tracing.
Cool. Web Vitals, only for Chrome, Edge, and Opera?
Yes, I believe so. Possibly also Brave, I'm not entirely sure. I expect that support will be coming to other browsers, but as this has been pioneered by Google, it's only the Chrome and Chromium browsers that have full support today.
What is Sentry's impact on network's transaction weight?
Network transaction weight, I'm not sure I fully understand. Like,
oh yeah, so we're
6%?
just pending a custom header, so nothing really outside of that, just to make sure we can track these things as you would in some of these telemetry frameworks.
Cool. What is the difference between transactions and spans? Specifically, is there any difference in the kind of data that they can hold?
Yeah, so the way the model works is spans are collected up within a transaction, and transactions are collected up within a trace. So a span describes some part of your operation that's happening. So if I think about, like, let's just use the example of a page load operation, all of the different queries that are running, the assets that are loaded, those are all broken down into individual spans. So you can kind of see the sequence of events and how long things took. The transaction is where I can add like custom tags. It'll give me my breadcrumbs, my browser headers. Spans don't have individual breadcrumbs, for example. The transaction has breadcrumbs. Spans don't have individual tags, but they do have a set of span details that are collected. And then there's also this concept of a trace, which is what connects different transactions across multiple applications. So I have a transaction from the front end, one from the back end, maybe one from middleware, or one from a database server, and those are all connected together in a single trace.
Got it. Is machine performance taken into consideration? So the example is, if I get 100 users with very fast machines, will that improve my performance stats?
Potentially. Potentially, the front end performance can vary by the machine that you're using, right? So if you're on, if you're on an old cell phone on a 3G network and you have large asset sizes, they will take longer to load, and you will see that reflected in your transactions. If you're, if somebody's running a modern browser on a screaming fast system, things will render faster. Any server-side computation or processing will happen faster. But you can also explore that because all of those things are captured in the tags. So you can look at, like, am I on a slower network connection? Do I have limited device memory? A lot of that information is often captured in the transaction, so you can kind of explore and see what impact that's having and understand what's the difference between somebody on a slow machine, a fast machine, on Windows versus Linux or Mac OS or something like that.
Yep. And another to add on to Jeremy's response, this is a big reason why we have the P times, right? To kind of get those outliers out of there so that we can understand what the general trend is. Number two, you may have seen the filter bar on performance as well as Discover. You'll see it in all parts of our product. So you can filter out some of those things. So we have nots, we have ands and ors and whatnot. So you can go ahead, create a view and or a saved search and have that type of query built in so that you're viewing the appropriate data set that you may care about and discluding those that you may not care about.
Kind of related, can you talk more about the Sentry query language?
Yeah, so query language, it's not really a query language, and that's kind of how we designed it. It's hitting our REST API Discover, which we've also named to the front end interface Discover, but you're defining the columns that you care about. So that's the data set that you care about. And then you're basically hammering our entire data set, our global events table, according to those columns, and you can filter and pivot on this data as necessary. So whether it's you want to zone in on a different environment or a specific tag or a set of tags or a time frame, all of that can be done. And it's more or less, we want you to do this within a couple clicks rather than having to learn a query language. Is how we've kind of approached this problem.
Great. Does Sentry handle synchronous transactions in the same way as async transactions? So will it aggregate metrics from a checkout HTTP call and a corresponding check inventory background task?
Yes, I would say yes, it does. There's a there is a different query, there is a different transaction type attribute, I think, that can be assigned for worker tasks. I'm not sure, but they can be instrumented the same way. So you'll get the same transaction information, like if it's instrumented from a worker task that's running async as you would from a synchronous transaction.
Yeah, and that's kind of the beauty of this. I mean, if you look at Sentry's pipeline as well, we have a bunch of all of this, right? And we're looking to trace a lot of this through our systems, because once it goes into one of these things where it might be async, you don't always know what essentially happens. So this is in the microservices world, we're going to have both our sync and async and our workers and all our consumers and all of this type of stuff that we want you to be able to understand what's going on.
Great. I'm going to keep these going. We've got just a couple more to get through here. If I'm running a single page app that can have different transactions without changing the URL in my browser, can I set up custom transactions to be tracked on each page?
Yes.
Yeah.
Just be Sentry.start transactions.
Yeah, that's documented in the SDKs. You will need to customize a little bit to change the names, obviously, but it can absolutely be done.
What's the benefit of tracking P65 versus, say, P95 or P99?
It's just so, as Neil sort of touched on a little bit in one of the earlier questions, but it's just different views of your data, right? So if I want to understand, it depends on the question I'm trying to answer, but if I want to understand sort of what's the median experience, then that's my P50. If I want to understand, like Google defines their pass-fail thresholds for the Web Vitals at P75, that is probably in recognition of the fact that there are a lot of different devices that things are running on, and front end tends to be a lot more variable and noisy than backend transactions, which tend to be like they're running on the same hardware. They're much more consistent. So like most of the teams that I've worked on, when we track backend transactions, we look in terms of P95, but on the front end, you may want to look at P75. And it's really a question of what type of experience do you care about, right? If you're worried about nearly all of your users having a good experience, I would say P95 is probably the highest you want to go in front end, just because there's a lot of outliers. So if you get into that last 5% of the data, you're getting a lot of noise and not very much signal. On the back end, you may track to P99 or P99.9 if you want to get look at a vast array of your data. There will always be a few outliers. So that's why in terms of performance, we're always talking in terms of percentiles, because if you look at the P100 and it's off by default in Sentry, you can turn it on and see like where your outliers are. So you can kind of highlight the P100 and see what what that data looks like. But those are truly like, they generally represent problems in the in capturing the transaction. So like, a browser went to sleep and then it woke back up and then the transaction took 3 hours, or that sort of thing. So you get all sorts of like weird, noisy data that's not meaningful. And so that's why you focus in on some of those values and say, I want to throw away the top 5% because that's noise. I want to focus on the 95%, which is like what my customers are actually experiencing in the wild, or I want to get a sense of like my median, etc.
Great. Can we create a common set of metrics across all projects so that we don't have to recreate things? In addition, is there a way to map a request across multiple projects?
So the answer to the second part is yes. Like that, when I showed, for example, going from the front end transaction to the back end, those are two separate projects in the demo account. So one is in the FE React front end project, and the other is in the Flask back end project. So it will link through. As Neil mentioned, I think you can't get multi-project views unless you have the business account. So you can try, if you want to get multi-project views at the same time, that's a business plan feature. On team, you can still have multiple projects. They still link through. You can just, you look at them one at a time. Can you repeat the first part of the question? Because I wasn't sure I fully followed that.
Yeah, sure. Can we create a common set of metrics across all of our projects so that we don't have to recreate things?
Yeah, so I think the default instrumentation like will capture, so like for example, the web vitals as a common set of measurements, you can define those SLOs. So like the work that the example that I showed in Discover, you can define that SLO across multiple projects. In the business plan, you could just select whichever projects you want, set up that data, and you've got sort of web vitals on all your front end projects. Transaction duration is universal. You will always have transaction duration. So that's another one that you can use. And you can also tag things, like you can add custom tags if you want, in a consistent way across different transactions to create sort of that commonality. But yeah, you can establish baselines across multiple transactions, multiple projects.
Great. Cool. We have time for a few more. We'll wrap things up here with 5 till the hour. Are web vitals tracked by default for any pages where I have Sentry installed, or should we do any configuration setup to start tracking these?
It's automatic. So as soon as you turn on tracing in any of the JavaScript SDKs, you'll automatically start collecting the web vitals.
Cool. I saw something related to react.mount in the trace. Could you speak more how it was captured and how granular it is?
Yeah. So we recently introduced a React framework integration. So we're hooking into some of kind of the more specifics of React. So the mount is one of them. I think there might be something with component loads as well. So I don't know the exact set of things that we captured there, but it's done through our React integration where we're hooking onto these things and instrumenting, as I mentioned, intelligently and minimally so that we can grab you that information.
Cool. And last one, and if we didn't get to answer your question, I'll follow up with you with answers to those. There's about 8 or so outstanding, but I will get you all answers to your questions afterwards. But the last one we'll answer here today: how do you track React navigations if your project is not using React Router? Our project is logging transactions when you go to a bookmark or reload the page, but not just on user clicks.
Yeah, I would have to check exactly on that. Just with regards to the SDK, if it's going to automatically track those navigation changes. I know on the JavaScript side, we already track navigation changes regardless of the React integration and such. So my assumption or kind of my inclination is to say yes, but I do want to definitely back this up and verify.
Yeah, I would also have to check the docs to be 100% sure. That being said, the general approach is, install the SDK specific to whichever framework you're using. So if you're using React but not React Router, go ahead and set up the React SDK, turn it on, and the transactions will start flowing in. See what information you have, and then we can work with you to try to figure out like if there's something else that you should be adding or doing to kind of capture those, or if it's going to require a little bit of customization. But if you're seeing, see what comes in automatically out of the SDK, and if it's not quite sufficient, oftentimes you can add to it, yourself, with a little bit of customization.
Yeah. And that would just be a matter of finding that common code that we need to go into and just do a sentry.start spanner, just hook it in once so that it gets triggered from then on.
Great. Well, that'll wrap the Q&A part up. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, everyone, for asking such awesome questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, we do have a promo code that we want to share with you all so you can try some of these features out. So the way you'll access or redeem this promo code, if you're in the app, just click on settings. Under your subscription, you'll see redeem promo code. Simply add the promo code there and it will apply as credits to your current account and any future billing. And the promo code, good for 1 month of Sentry's business plan, which is about $80 value, is PM Workshop. And I will send a follow-up email just kind of reiterating this so that you have it documented in email. But PM Workshop. And then, we do have, again, one question after I end the meeting here that will pop up in your browser. Please answer it if you have a few seconds just to make these workshops better in the future. We always look for improvements. But with that, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for attending. You'll receive an email with a link to the recording in the coming days. Thank you so much and have a fantastic rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.